Warning. The following documentary contains blinding flashes of hot pink, lethal doses of white concealer, and platform boots high enough to cause altitude sickness. Viewer discretion is advised. Picture this. You're in Shibuya, Tokyo, sometime in the mid to late 90s. The Japanese economy is in the gutter, unemployment is climbing, and you're probably dragging yourself to yet another job interview you're in absolutely no mood for. Then, out of the corner of your eye, you spot this. More and more of these girls have been popping up across Japan's youth mecca lately. Burberry scarves, loose socks, hair somewhere between bleach blonde and chestnut brown, skirts hiked up to lengths they have just about zero business being at. And if you're really lucky, you might even spot one of these girls, rocking jet black makeup that looks like nothing else that Japan had ever seen. What in God's green earth is going on here? Well, what you're looking at, my unemployed friend, is the rise of one of Japan's single most iconic youth subcultures. And one simple umbrella term covers all of it. Gyaru. The story of Gyaru, late 20th century Japan's most defining girls' fashion movement, is a genuinely fascinating one. Far more than just a passing trend or a simple fad, it's a story of youthful rebellion, sexuality, female confidence, class divides, full-blown moral panic, and most importantly, the slow shattering of some of Japan's most deeply held social norms. A story carried by a generation of young Japanese women born into a country that seemed to be changing shape every single day. So, it raises the question, what the is Gyaru? So, shattering norms is one of the central themes running through this entire story, right? But which norms exactly were the Gyaru of the 1990s and the 2000s shattering exactly? Well, interestingly enough, the linguistic roots of the word Gyaru itself actually give us a pretty solid place to start. For the katakana savvy among you, you may have already deciphered what Gyaru literally means. It's a simple loan word from English, just girl or gal if you're feeling fancy. Of course, Gyaru isn't the word the Japanese historically reached for to describe a young woman. I mean, they had plenty of their own words for that, long before they'd ever laid eyes on the foreigner. Which means that Gyaru carries a very specific meaning within Japanese, one that interestingly has shifted several times over the past century. The earliest documented appearance of the word comes from a 1931 Japanese dictionary, where it is defined as a derogatory term used to mock young women. Specifically, women in her late teens or early 20s described as healthy and energetic, or less charitably, frivolous. So even back in the early Showa era of the 1930s, this word was already attached to women seen as embodying something unusual, perhaps even undesirable, but Japan's notoriously rigid social standards. Kind of a foreshadowing, as we will see very soon. Now, the term Gyaru then fell out of use for decades, multiple generations, an entire world war, and the single greatest economic comeback in modern history would pass before Gyaru resurfaced as part of the very youth fashion revolution this video is all about. But before that could happen, a few crucial things needed to occur between the 1930s and the early 1990s. Chief among them, the rise of Japan's rebellious youth subcultures. That story begins almost as soon as Japan started rebuilding after the war. The Bosozoku biker gangs from the 1950s onward, the hippie-adjacent Futensoku of the 1960s, the Bancho and Sukeban school delinquents. Post-occupation Japan had an ongoing, ever-evolving lineage of rebellious youth movements pushing back against its rigid social hierarchies. But the direct path to the modern meaning of Gyaru runs through something a little more specific. A heady mix of carefree hedonism, a genuinely controversial fashion trend. The peak of the Tokyo club scene, and the bodycon craze of the late 80s and early 90s. Tokyo back then was one enormous party. Money was everywhere, and clubs were springing up like wildflowers. A handful rose above the rest to become the city's go-to destinations. Shibaura Gold, which opened in 1989, and right nearby, Juliana's Tokyo, short-lived but utterly legendary, constantly making headlines for being loud, raunchy, controversial, and a hell of a lot of fun. The club's signature feature, 2 elevated platforms flanking the dance floor, hosted a mix of professional dancers and ordinary women dancing their hearts out, admired from below by men and women alike. Many of those ordinary women fit a very specific profile. Office ladies, fresh off the clock, who'd shed their work clothes for one of those skin-tight bodycon dresses and became, at least for a few hours, someone entirely different. And this is where the word Gyaru properly resurfaced in Japan. It had been quietly bubbling up in various forms throughout the preceding decades, as a Wrangler jeans sub-brand in the 70s, in the titles of a few fashion magazines in the 80s, and a song about fun-loving, superficial women that brought the word right back to its original 1930s meaning. By the mid to late 80s, gal or gyaru as a descriptor for sexually liberated, somewhat scandalous women had fully embedded itself in everyday Japanese. To the conservative, patriarchal society of bubble-era Japan, those office ladies dancing the night away at Juliana's in skin-tight dresses, they were the living embodiment of exactly what the word meant. So, the club scene of the late bubble era was absolutely thriving. Naturally, watching the adults party like that left an impression on those who were still too young to get in on the action. High schoolers. Bouncers at Tokyo's nightclubs suddenly began noticing a distinctively younger crowd hanging around outside, underage students trying every trick in the book to sneak past the rope into the same clubs frequented by the bodycon-clad office ladies. And right here, my friends, this is where the actual history of the modern Gyaru movement begins. So where did this wave of underage aspiring party girls actually come from? Well, affluent families first and foremost, from Tokyo neighborhoods like Setagaya, Meguro, and Suginami, areas that had spent the preceding decades solidifying themselves as comfortably upper middle class. And that detail matters, because class and geography were both absolutely central to how Gyaru came to exist in the first place. Take a look at where those districts actually sit. You might notice something. They surround the bustling center of Tokyo, which meant that the children of these well-off families had easy access to the city's trendiest neighborhoods, Harajuku, Aoyama, and increasingly, right here, Shibuya. And it was in Shibuya's clubs starting in the early 1990s that you'd find the highest concentration of party-hungry high school girls in the entire city, drawn there for one specific reason, a reason that goes by the name Teamers. Teamers were young Japanese men defined by 3 things above everything else: money, partying, and a complete disregard for the rules. Almost all of them attended elite private schools or universities, came from wealthy families, and treated their studies as a minor inconvenience at best. Because why bother excelling academically when daddy's connections will sort everything out anyway? But throwing a lame-ass party at home was strictly for poor peasants, and so the Teamers needed somewhere proper to lose their minds. Naturally, that meant Tokyo's fastest-growing youth hub, Shibuya. Club parties organized by rich young male students became the hottest thing in the neighborhood from the late 1980s onwards, eventually growing so popular that groups of these spoiled rich kids banded together to throw the most outrageous student parties Tokyo had ever seen. That also explains the name, Chima or Teamers, because they quite literally organized into teams, each one claiming its own slice of Shibuya as their territory. Parties were wild, and the guys throwing them became seriously popular, especially with the girls. Young high school girls hoping to get into these exclusive Shibuya parties quickly figured out that dressing the part was probably one of the easiest way to catch a Teamer's eye. And the Teamers, as it turned out, were genuine fashion innovators in their own right, keeping the American influence but giving it a rougher, more casual edge. West Coast styling, surfer touches, silver jewelry, a dash of Guns N' Roses. Mix all of that together, and you got yourself a Teamer. And so the rich, rebellious girls of Shibuya did their best to match that energy. The LA aesthetic became the standard, and tanning salons became essential because you absolutely needed that golden glow to properly show off that bare midriff. And for at least some of these girls, that strategy worked. The teamers noticed, made them their girlfriends, and just like that, a brand new fashion movement among young female students in Shibuya was born. And one that would go on to outlive and massively outshine the very boys it was originally designed to impress. You see, that whole teamer phenomenon, as it turned out, was pretty short-lived. Territorial disputes between rival teams escalated into actual violence, some with actual casualties too. Between the bad press and the rapidly souring economy, the lavish parties of rich high schoolers and college kids simply faded out somewhere between 1991 and 1992. But the teamers' girlfriends, many of them had genuinely taken to the style, especially the younger ones, who would go on to establish the first true generation of Gyaru, the Kogyaru. According to legend, it was the bouncers at Shibuya's nightclubs who coined the term Kogyaru, which literally means little gal, to describe these underage girls constantly trying to sneak into clubs they had absolutely no business being in. But wherever the name actually came from, it stuck, attaching itself to a new generation of young schoolgirls who took their predecessors' look and pushed it much, much further. The tan stayed, the expensive Louis V bags stayed, but now they were combined with the one fashion item that would come to define the entire Gyaru movement from that point forward. The school uniform. Keeping that uniform on long after the final bell rang actually makes a whole lot more sense than you might think. Remember, the Kogyaru, much like the teamers before them, were the children of wealthy families attending Tokyo's most prestigious private schools, and it just so happened that those same schools had just started redesigning their uniforms to look genuinely fashionable starting in the late 1980s. Almost overnight, the school uniform flipped from an outfit you couldn't wait to take off the second you got home, into a serious flex. Wearing it around Shibuya signaled exactly two things: money and good taste. So the girls wore it proudly all over the neighborhood that had become the center of their universe. The Kogyaru, however, weren't just rich kids, they were rebellious rich kids. So they made a few key adjustments to make sure that the look was unmistakably theirs. The standard knee-length skirt got hiked into a miniskirt, loose, slouchy socks were added, and perhaps most daring of all, they dyed their hair away from the natural black most Japanese people are born with into a lighter, bolder chestnut shade known as chapatsu. Just like that, the signature look of the Kogyaru, the earliest true iteration of Gyaru, was born. Just a handful of small adjustments, yet already enough to start cracking some of Japan's most deeply held norms. In the eyes of bubble-era Japan, the ideal schoolgirl was pale, modest, and quietly obedient. But the Kogyaru, they were none of those things. By 1993, their look had become a small but undeniably noticeable presence on the streets of Shibuya, and over the following 5 years, that same style would go on to completely take over Japanese school culture, becoming the default look for trendy teenage girls nationwide, before then giving birth to something far stranger and far more shocking than conservative Japan had ever seen. So, the Kogyaru style spread like wildfire between 1993 and 1998. How exactly? Well, as with most fashion phenomena, mass media played the decisive role in turning Kogyaru from a noteworthy but geographically contained Shibuya curiosity into a full-blown national high school fashion revolution. Magazines slowly began clocking the trend. By the end of 1993, men's magazines in particular had made the Kogyaru their newest, biggest fixation, which was about to take a very strange, very controversial turn. Because in the end, what better way to spread a fashion trend than a good old-fashioned moral panic? If you know anything about Japan in the 1990s, you'll also know that the country was absolutely primed and ready for exactly that. As we touched on earlier, the early 90s represented a massive societal shift for Japan. The bursting of the 80s bubble economy brought on an economic downturn and rising unemployment levels rarely seen in the nation's recorded history. That social and economic backdrop then also opened a real generational divide as the decade progressed, with the generation that grew up in the post-war boom quick to point fingers at the new, younger Heisei-era generation, viewed by many as lazy, morally compromised, and materialistic. And in the middle of all that, along came Kogyaru, a fashion statement born from delinquent culture, equal parts sexy and provocative. Of course, it made for an irresistibly easy scapegoat, and the thing that would catapult Kogyaru into the absolute center of the national conversation, both as a cool new look and as a symbol of a corrupted generation and crumbling schoolgirl morals, came in the form of something called Enjo Kōsai. And oh boy, was it a big deal. Now, if you want to get a really good idea of how Enjo Kōsai worked and how weird and sometimes dangerous it was, look no further than the 1998 movie Love and Pop, which, I've been using clips from this entire time, directed by, Anu Hideaki of Neon Genesis Evangelion fame. Great frickin' movie. Anyway, Enjo Kōsai, which can be translated as compensated dating, quickly became one of the biggest Japanese buzzwords of that entire decade, its roots tracing back to exactly the same period Kogyaru was emerging. Crucially, to the exact same moment, new communications technology started reshaping how young Japanese people interacted. This was the era mobile phone adoption began gaining real traction. More importantly, when a little device called the Pokeberu, a basic pager, swept the nation. It was affordable enough for high schoolers to buy. They did in huge numbers. Nearly 50% of high school girls in Japan had one by 1993. And alongside that came terekura, or telephone clubs, an easy way for men to connect directly with young women over the phone. Just like that, almost overnight, the entire concept of parental oversight regarding who a teenage girl might be talking to or meeting completely changed. That's also when money entered the conversation. Eventually, men who had no other way of convincing high schoolers to spend time with them started offering cash instead. We're talking serious money. 10,000 yen or roughly $100 for a 3-minute date at a restaurant, for example. Yes, $100 for 3 minutes. Now imagine you're 15, 16 years old. That's an enormous amount of money for doing essentially nothing. Naturally, plenty of girls were tempted to give it a try, and in the overwhelming majority of cases, giving it a try meant exactly that. Meeting a guy, talking for a few minutes, nothing more. Quite a few girls even turned the whole thing into a prank, agreeing to dates with desperate creepy old dudes, and simply never showing up. At worst, it was a few minutes of mild awkwardness in exchange for decent money. At best, it was a genuinely funny way of messing with some sleazy adults. But then, the media caught wind of it, through a now familiar cocktail of sensationalism and outright fabrication, turned a strange little side hustle into a full-blown national crisis. Under the banner of Enjo Kōsai, magazines, newspapers, and TV programs ran wall-to-wall coverage claiming young girls across the country were straight up engaging in teenage prostitution, selling themselves to the highest bidder. Something the vast majority of these girls were absolutely not doing. The public saw the headlines, and the public did as the public does, and believed them. Parents, somewhat understandably to be fair, panicked at the idea of their daughters being swept up in this. Meanwhile, high school girls across the country were, for the first time, being introduced by the media to the very idea that this kind of arrangement even existed in the first place. And that's precisely when a smaller number of girls actually did start showing up in Shibuya looking to make real money this way. A self-fulfilling prophecy, manufactured almost entirely by the mass media. Naturally, the root cause identified by society at large was not, say, the fact that middle-aged Japanese men were actually trying to purchase sex from minors. No, the blame landed almost exclusively on the materialistic, morally bankrupt younger generation. Conveniently, there was a brand new controversial fashion trend ready to serve as the cherry on top of the scapegoat sundae. And that's how Kogyaru, until then a fairly niche style among a few groups of rebellious Shibuya schoolgirls, exploded into a full-blown national phenomenon. through controversy, manufactured almost entirely by the very institutions reporting on it. Spotting the sexually provocative edge some Shibuya girls had embraced, the media wasted exactly no time directly linking the Enjo Kōsai panic, the one they had essentially invented, to the Kogyaru aesthetic. Within no time, the combination of a shortened school uniform, a Louis V bag, loose socks, dyed hair, and a tan became shorthand for teenage prostitution in the public imagination. Combine that with a nationwide parental panic, a newfound and deeply unsettling sexual obsession among middle-aged men, and rising curiosity among the girls themselves. Suddenly, every single person in Japan knew exactly what Kogyaru looked like. It boosted the style's visibility and popularity enormously, simultaneously devastated the reputation of the girls who were simply dressing the way they wanted to dress. It's genuinely difficult to overstate just how massive the Kogyaru phenomenon became by the mid to late 90s. By 1997, Egg magazine under editor Yonehara Yasumasa had become the undisputed bible of Gyaru culture. New slang terms born from the subculture entered pop culture and everyday Japanese. Popstar Amuro Namie became the very first true Gyaru icon, and around the same time, a fashion building called Shibuya 109, open since 1979 but only modestly successful for most of its existence, fully committed to the trend and transformed itself into a Kogyaru paradise. It was the subculture's shopping mecca, its primary hangout, and eventually a workplace for legions of tan schoolgirls. With easy access to affordable clothing that mimicked the Kogyaru style while simultaneously allowing it to move beyond the school uniform, the style was no longer the exclusive domain of daughters of wealthy families. It had become increasingly middle class, increasingly widespread, and at a certain point, simply became the default look for girls across Tokyo and well beyond. As Japan approached the turn of the millennium, the Kogyaru aesthetic had become the single defining fashion statement of the country. But that explosive popularity came with some serious downsides for the actual girls living it. Thanks to the style's rapid spread and its constant association with compensated dating in the media, girls who genuinely just enjoyed the look and who had simply made Shibuya their after-school hangout now found themselves under intense public scrutiny. Worse, facing a sharp rise in unwanted advances from middle-aged men who, having absorbed everything they'd seen on TV and in magazines, assumed that the style itself was an open invitation to, only in the rarest of cases was the tan at the shortened skirt actually intended to attract men willing to pay for sex, but the damage had already been done. So, just as the Gyaru subculture had broken fully into the mainstream, it was about to evolve at lightning speed. Partly by inventing a look so unsettling that not even the creepiest, horniest middle-aged salaryman would want anything to do with it. The evolution beyond what Kogyaru had been since 1993 became increasingly obvious the more mainstream the style got. Interestingly, the first major shift didn't originate in wealthy Shibuya at all. It came from a far less affluent neighborhood called Kamata. There, a new strain of Kogyaru emerged that pushed the aesthetic further than anyone did before. Darker tans, streaks of silver through the hair. It was a look created by and for lower middle class teenagers attempting to imitate a subculture that had, after all, originated with wealthy delinquents. This more intense version of the style spread to other parts of Tokyo, Ikebukuro, Eastern Shinjuku. Around the same time, the increasingly affordable and increasingly extreme Kogyaru look began attracting a new wave of delinquent teens. By 1998, older delinquent subcultures like the Yankee had been largely replaced or absorbed entirely into the Gyaru movement. With that absorption came a genuine shift in the style's DNA. Tans got even darker, hair got even brighter, platform boots entered the picture. The transformation was significant enough that the term Kogyaru was now retired to the history books, and this new generation simply called themselves Gyaru. No more Ko, no more little gal. And it was this new late 90s generation that also went on to invent the subculture's next dominant and by far most extreme look. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Ganguro. So, I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now. Isn't this just blackface? And fair question. Honestly, kind of, yes. Ganguro literally translates to blackface. Committing to the look meant either putting in serious hours at the tanning salon or applying really dark foundation, then layering on fake eyelashes and outrageous hair color to complete the transformation. And remarkably, it caught on hard within the subculture. A summer 1999 survey found that more than 99% of Egg magazine readers had adopted the Ganguro look. Kogyaru was officially dead. Ganguro was the Grim Reaper. Now, while Ganguro was obviously a deeply controversial aesthetic, I'm relieved to say it carried none of the ugly racial intent of its American blackface counterpart. Thank God for that. Rather than being designed to mock or stereotype a minority group, the actual motivation behind Ganguro was, in its own strange way, fairly relatable. It was engineered to be extreme enough to scare off two very specific groups: people outside the Gyaru subculture, and more pointedly, men. And it worked beautifully. The same men's magazines that had spent years drooling over Kogyaru were now thoroughly disgusted by where Ganguro had taken things. Even the mainstream media that had feasted on the Enjo Kōsai panic and the Kogyaru quickly lost interest entirely. I mean, think about it. The original Kogyaru style had been perfectly positioned for a media firestorm. Sexy and controversial, but just innocent looking enough that even ordinary high schoolers could adopt it. But Ganguro offered no such accessibility. No upper middle class family expected or wanted their daughter to scorch herself at a tanning salon or cake on makeup that dark just to stay on trend. Ganguro pushed the tanning and dark makeup even harder, and Yamamba, which literally means mountain witch, took the whole concept into full war paint territory. The general public was horrified. The Gyaru themselves, thrilled. They had built a look that let them escape the gaze of predatory older men entirely, and in doing so, accidentally created something close to unprecedented. A genuinely homegrown modern Japanese fashion movement, one that looked neither west nor towards mainstream fashion media for inspiration, but emerged organically from the streets of lower middle class Tokyo. It was a style that on the surface screams for attention, underneath it all says "leave me alone" louder than anything else. Whether or not it's your particular cup of tea aesthetically, because let me tell you, it's certainly not mine, that is genuinely cool. And so, Gyaru entered the 2000s with the most extreme, most unique look the subculture had ever produced. But where could it possibly go from there? I mean, it had to go somewhere. After all, Persona 3 tells us that Japanese high schoolers still rock the style in 2009. Well, Gyaru certainly went somewhere. By the early 2000s, a phenomenon called Ogyaru, the O standing for dirty, emerged in Shibuya. Mostly school dropouts, and by most accounts, a genuinely rough crowd. Rarely bathing, rarely changing their underwear by some reports. Look, I love the spirit behind Ganguro, but I'ma be real honest here. That might be taking the whole escape the male gaze mission slightly too far. Then came Gyaru Mama, young single mothers who adopted the Gyaru look and started bringing their kids along to hang out in Shibuya. The younger Gyaru generation was, understandably, not thrilled about that. I mean, this was supposed to be their youth mecca, after all. In short, what had once been a cool, sexy, easily imitated fashion statement for Japanese high schoolers now transformed into something almost universally undesirable. Undesirable by design in some respects, sure, but undesirable all the same. Young girls increasingly didn't want to be associated with Ganguro and its offshoots. The style entered a sharp, steady decline through the early 2000s. Shibuya emptied out of Gyaru almost entirely, Egg magazine struggled. The mainstream simply stopped caring. It was death, or near death, by extremism. By pushing the look and the culture behind it to its absolute breaking point, Gyaru had effectively burned itself to the ground. So what happened next? Well, despite everything, Gyaru didn't completely disappear overnight or anything. Through the mid-2000s, the subculture then quietly reinvented itself in the wake of Ganguro's burnout, splintering into a whole range of new sub-styles that put the aesthetic in entirely different directions. Oneke, or literally older sister style, stripped back the extremity and replaced it with something more polished and grown up. Elegant dresses, softer makeup, a look built for the Gyaru who had aged out of the Shibuya pavement scene, but wasn't quite ready to leave the subculture behind entirely. Hime Gyaru went the other way entirely, leaning into a full princess fantasy of lace, pastel colors, and voluminous curls. Agejo, pushed into the mainstream by the magazine Koakuma Ageha from 2006 onward, brought a glamorous, nightlife-adjacent edge that became one of the defining looks of the late 2000s. Basically, Gyaru had fractured, but its spirit remained very much alive. The landscape then shifted permanently as the 2010s arrived. Print magazines that had served as the subculture's lifeblood since the egg days quickly began to fade. Smartphones replaced Shibuya's pavements as the real center of youth culture, and the extreme unhinged peak of the movement had burned itself out. With it, the infrastructure that had kept Gyaru coherent as a unified scene. And while its structural peak will almost certainly always belong to that electric, hyper-rebellious window of the late 90s and early 2000s, subculture successfully outlived the physical streets of Tokyo. Today it has found a massive, genuinely global second life through Y2K digital nostalgia, TikTok styling videos, and international online communities. Egg magazine was even relaunched, which is a testament to just how much appetite there still is for what it represented. And impressively, the subculture even left a permanent mark on a Japanese cultural lexicon. Across modern social media, the phrase Gyaru Mind has survived as a widely recognized badge of honor, representing a mindset of proactive positivity, fierce self-affirmation, and a cheerful, total refusal to care what anyone else thinks of you. And ain't that beautiful? Because underneath a century of shifting slang, charcoal dark foundation, and hot pink fabric, the core philosophy of Gyaru remained pretty much untouched throughout all of it. It was never really about the clothes. It was about the radical, unapologetic courage to look traditional Japanese society dead in the eyes, then dress purely for yourself. Well, I guess it was also a little bit about the clothes. But you get the point. But now, I think it's time for a Patreon class roll call. Raise your hand if you're present. The Hockey Gentleman, Saxonfox, D-Fox, Saikajo, Khalid Lepta, Xoiabu, Tricoat, Kevin Hickson, Buns, Journeyman351, RK0, Michael Smith, Hajimeno James, Utku Hussein Kaya, Steve Matsui, Hypanen, Javier Soravia, Midnight Channel, Turam, Maruinu, Boo Cakes, Chris Scott, Mickey Cox, Michael Wagner, CJ and Mary, Cats and Soup, Chart B-Man, Ben Harradine, White Gilden, Sierra DC, T-Bird, Metal Mama, Ian Farmer, Chris Wallace, JR Horse, Adea Kono, Guillaume Climo y Garcia, Ilya Kuznirovic, Jay-Z, Quintet, Microhacks, Jules Schönefus, Terminal, and Kita Kitsune, Northern Fox. To you and to everyone else, thank you so much for watching. じゃあまたね。